Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokwariola. First, it was almost impossible, then it was very unlikely in what later turned out to be Christmas in November, when power finally changed hands for the first time in 4 decades. Well, today marks it exactly 1 year ago when Africa's oldest president stepped down from office, signaling the end of a political era in Zimbabwe. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on economic and political developments in Zimbabwe 1 year after Robert Mugabe stepped down as president? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report and Africa Today will be right back. Welcome on board.
Robert Mugabe resigned as Zimbabwe's president a year ago, ending his 37-year rule over southern African country. Until it was succeeded by Emmerson Mnangagwa on November 24, 2017, Mugabe was the only leader Zimbabwe had known since independence from Britain. While the West regards the 94-year-old as an autocrat, some in Africa saw him as an anti-colonial champion.
The Western countries, in particular the United States and the European Union, who imposed illegal sanctions against Zimbabwe, have, to our surprise and that of SADC and the rest of Africa, refused to remove those sanctions.
Mugabe came to power after the 7 years of a liberation bush war. But nearly 4 decades after independence in 1980, many saw him as power-obsessed and willing to unleash death squads, rig elections and trash the economy in the relentless pursuit of control. Mugabe portrayed himself as a radical African nationalist, competing against racist and imperialist forces in Washington and London. Mugabe's hold on Zimbabwe was weakened when the army seized power. A week before, Mugabe sacked his vice president Mnangagwa, ZANU-PF's favorite, to succeed him, to smooth paths to the presidency for his 52-year-old wife, Grace. Celebrations broke out in the parliament when Mugabe's resignation was announced, following an intended impeachment proceedings that led to his firing by the ruling ZANU-PF. People in the capital, Harare, danced and cheered as they heard the news.
Welcome back. Now, before we get into the discussion of the day, let's update you on the top stories around Africa. A Cameroon military official says the military has freed 9 children and a teacher who has been kidnapped by gunmen from a school in Kumba in the country's restive East English-speaking southwest region. Well, dozens of migrants have been forced off a cargo vessel by Libyan authorities after refusing to disembark over fears of abuses in a move decried by human rights groups. And Kenya's police chief says gunmen have kidnapped an Italian volunteer along Kenya's coast. Now joining me to look at the economic and political developments in Zimbabwe 1 year after Robert Mugabe stepped down as president is Biodun Sowunmi, African Affairs analyst. And on Skype I have Alfonce Mbiwzo, journalist based in Harare, Zimbabwe. Good to have you gentlemen on the program.
I'm pleased to be here.
Now let's start with you now, Biodun. How would you say Zimbabwe has fared 1 year after the ouster of Mugabe?
A year down the line, very little has changed in Zimbabwe.
Excuse me.
What you see is Zimbabwe has gone through a process of transition,
right,
from one ruler to the other, from the oldest ruler and the only ruler to Emmerson Mnangagwa. But little has changed in terms of when you look at the economy, not much has changed. We're back to the era where people queue for basic foodstuffs. You queue at the petrol station. Government is using electronic means of paying people, and then they get to the bank. They can't get the cash to withdraw. You have long queues of people, still at the banks, very long queue. You have shortages in terms of cooking oil. People it has to be rationed. Shortages in terms of petrol, kerosene, and some basic staple foods. Pharmacies are without drugs, and those private pharmacies with drugs are having to charge people to pay in dollars.
Exorbitantly,
At the same time, when you look at the political space, yes, there is freedom of expression promised by Emerson Mnangagwa, the current president, but then there has been a trail of criticisms over the way the government has gone about it, to the point that the opposition leader, Chimnanza, said, let me try and say what he said, that is, you have freedom of expression, but after expression, you don't have your freedom any longer. People are not being arrested. They're still being arrested for insulting the president. Whatever the authorities deem to be insultive remarks, that is going on. Then you have the debt overhang, which the government is trying to grapple with. Zimbabwe has a debt of $16.9 billion. Inflation currently is galloping, at 20.9%. The president promised, we don't know whether he has done that, by the end of October last year, he would have paid them $2 billion in terms of arrears, in what is owed to African Development Bank and the World Bank. Surprisingly, the Western countries who had been at the, at the height of pushing Mugabe out, they have refused to leave the sanctions, imposed on Mugabe, which caused the problem to start with in the first instance. It was the sanctions imposed by United States and European countries over what they termed to be forceful expropriation of the land, owned by the white people and being redistributed to the black people, that led to the economic collapse of Zimbabwe. It's not actually the fact that those lands were taken away, because the lands were still being tilled. So the West still refused till now to do anything about it, because United States particularly is pushing that, except there are some reforms. Whether it is liked by the people of Zimbabwe or not, that is exactly what they want to see.
So from your own theory, from your own analysis,
little has changed.
Nothing has been changed.
Very little.
Little has been changed
what has
in Zimbabwe.
changed in terms of corruption, it's just about the police, mounting roadblocks in Zimbabwe. They've now been removed. Under Mugabe, police were everywhere, mounting roadblocks and using it to extort money. That is no more the case in Zimbabwe. That is the little that has changed. Then the fact that oppositions are able to hold rallies and protest, now. Those are the little things that have changed.
All right, Alfonce Mbiwzo, you're on the ground journalist in Zimbabwe. How would you say Zimbabwe has fared? Do you think Zimbabwe today meets the expectation of an average Zimbabwean when the coup happened last November?
Not by a long shot. I think my colleague here is very well versed with what actually is happening in the country, because the same issues we are facing now, we were facing them even under Mugabe. The difference is, if you mentioned the issue of the debt overhang, the biggest of which is the domestic debt. If you go to 6 years ago, the domestic debt was at 200 billion. 2 years ago, it was at 2 billion. And now it's at almost 10 billion. That's the domestic debt, excluding the external debt. And no one wants to explain how the government actually spent this money. If a situation where the government spent 5.5 billion in 6 months, and no one wants to answer questions as to how that happened and what was happening with the money. So you then have a situation where they hire a new finance minister, who by all accounts is very well educated, is a former African Development Bank vice president and chief economist, and also a financial engineer. He's trying to look at how to clean up the government books and balance the books. And then he puts in measures that are proving to be very unpopular, such as the new 2% tax, and then simply confirming what everyone knows, that the money in Zimbabweans' account is not US dollars, but some nameless currency. I did ask the minister a few weeks back that, okay, soon after I made that announcement that they are separating US accounts and local funded accounts, that, okay, so what currency is Zimbabwe using? He said it's just money. Even the minister knows he doesn't know the name of the currency Zimbabwe is using.
Wow.
So this is precipitated this whole situation then, where you have because now the businesses are panicked. They thought they were holding US. Now they've been told their currency is nameless and the value is subjective. On the black market, it's at 300%, 350%. On the bank, it's 1:1. So the prices they tend to reflect what's happening on the black market.
But Alfonso, with the state of economy you just painted for us now, how do you think the government can handle this trying moments in Zimbabwe, where the people had depended solely when it took office, via coup in November last year?
I think the biggest problem is that in terms of political reforms, Mnangagwa is basically in the same mold as Mugabe. My opinion is that Zimbabwe is actually in much more dangerous space with Mnangagwa than it was under Mugabe. The courts have previously outlawed this crime called insulting the president. Somehow Mnangagwa brought it back and people are being jailed for it. Is intolerant of any form of criticism, which is very dangerous because it then tends to make people self-censor themselves. It stifles freedom of speech, the very speech he claims to be promoting. But then that should not be a surprise because he himself has been taking off copying models such as Rwanda, or we all know is led by a dictator by another name. Even if you look at, the history of Singapore, for example, it involves elements of dictatorship.
Right.
So clearly that's the path he wants to go, which means Zimbabweans have to choose. Do they, or he has made a choice and he's making Zimbabweans know, and in a not too subtle way, that look, some of your freedoms have got to be kept. But what that means is that it then means Zimbabweans cannot ask about some of the excesses of the government, because seriously, we want to know what did they do with 5.3 billion in 6 months, which they're making people pay via some spurious tax.
Right, point taken there, Alfonso. Let me quickly come to you now, Biodun. Now, from what he's pointed out, clearly the Zimbabweans aren't too happy with what's on the ground, even though they wanted something better, last November. Now, the economy, according to him, it's nothing to write home about. More or less, about some decades ago, the country had suffered, we all know, high inflation rates and is in current debt right now. And people can, at this point, according to reports in this October, people then tend to lose more than it was decades ago. So would you say the people have no choice in terms of, okay, they voted this individual into power, they've kept the ZANU-PF into power, and what we get to see is what we get. So we have no choice in this case.
Yes, it's quite a very difficult situation for the people of Zimbabwe. One, because if you look at the way ZANU-PF, Mugabe built ZANU-PF since independence in 1980, it's been based on a patronage system whereby you have key allies and friends, commanding, the different sectors of the economy. Those are the people highly enriched when the boom was there,
right.
When Zimbabwe at a point was a major exporter of food, crops in Africa. But now, following the sanctions, things have changed. But the biggest challenge being faced by Zimbabwe today is the economy. Right. Because now when you go to the banks, you can't even get the money to withdraw. The Mnangagwa government tried to carry out a reform. They went about and said, look, we will change the Zimbabwean dollar to bonds, and they did the bonds. The bonds they're almost worthless now, trying to peg the bonds to dollars. But when you get to the banks, you can't even get it to buy. The major problem faced by Zimbabwe today is they don't even have the foreign currency, to import food or to import basic medicine, into the country. The government does not even have the foreign currency, to import petroleum products into the country. So that is leading to scarcity scarcity. So the economy is gradually grinding to a halt. Inflation today, as at October, inflation is running at 20.8%. You know, we are gradually creeping back to 2008, the era when we had the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. Now, the Western governments are actually taking steps to block Zimbabwe, particularly the United States, you know, from accessing further loans in the World Bank. Not necessarily due to the fault of World Bank or US, because Zimbabwe actually defaulted under Mugabe. So they have arrears which must be cleared. Zimbabwe does not have the money to clear the arrears. So what happens? That we are working gradually, if care is not taken, working towards implosion, social implosion in Zimbabwe, because something has to give way. The military is firmly controlled by Mnangagwa. Don't forget the head of the military when the revolutions happened in 2017, you know, is now the vice president of the country. So something has to give way. The West, what the West is demanding for is reforms. What they called the reforms, they need to qualify that in terms of what they're saying is they want to promote democracy in the country. I think that should be the choice of the people of Zimbabwe. They should be the one to determine their own fate, their political direction, not necessarily dictated from outside. Okay, let's quickly go on a very quick break. Now you're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at the economic and political developments in Zimbabwe 1 year after Robert Mugabe stepped down as president. Exactly 1 year ago, when the unthinkable happened in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's 37-year rule abruptly came to an end when he sent his resignation to the Speaker of the Parliament. Now, following days of siege by the military elites, backed by a group within the ZANU-PF ruling party, the conversation of how much has changed in the socio-political landscape of the South African nation remains on the spotlight. So, Alfonce, now let's look at this system where we have recycled leadership. You know, we're talking about military officers who have taken up presidential positions right now in Zimbabwe. Do you think Zimbabweans are getting the democracy they deserve, or is this the same case of the authoritarian rule all over again?
You could say it's more of the same because Mugabe pretty much brought the military into civilian affairs. He put military personnel in key ZANU-PF party positions and started integrating them in all levels of government, from running parastatals. Some of the biggest mining contracts excuse me, in the country have been awarded to military-related companies. These include diamond mining. Some of the companies have contracts in platinum mining, among a host of other key investments. So Mnangagwa has basically continued the same tradition, because you would recall 2016, the government, for example, cancelled all contracts for miners in Chiadzwa. As soon as Mnangagwa came to power, they were back, including the Chinese, and this time they're doing it quietly. No one knows what's going on. No one wants to ask, because the consequences are not something anyone is looking forward to. So you have the situation where the country is basically militarized. You have this all-pervasive military presence. So it's difficult for Zimbabweans then to argue that they have the democracy they need. They don't. it's a fearful democracy.
Right.
It's a watchful democracy.
Now, from what he's saying now, Biodun, definitely democracy is far from the people in Zimbabwe. But let's look at the ZANU-PF itself as a party, because right now there are internal battles the party has to contend with. That's looking at Mnangagwa and his first vice president, that's Chiwenga, who was instrumental in his assumption into office via the coup plot that was, that fateful coup plot that happened last November. What are your thoughts now on these internal wranglings? Do you think it would affect the social development of Zimbabwe?
Yeah, unfortunately, no matter how you look at it, the Zimbabweans are in a very difficult situation. In the first instance, to remove ZANU-PF from power through democratic means is a tall order. It is very, very difficult.
Right.
It is so well entrenched to the extent that, including when it comes to voting, the military seems to play a role in terms of intimidating people from either coming out to vote in opposition strongholds. So we've seen a pattern over the years of how this is done, and those structures are still in place. I cannot see Mnangagwa, dismantling those structures, because he himself actually helped to build them. In terms of repression, he also played a role in the past to repress the people of Zimbabwe. At the point he was, when about 26 people were killed, he was fingered to have been the one that, gave the orders. Yes. So, therefore, much will not change in that form. Where we have a major challenge is, how do you engage Zimbabwe? The West will not be willing to engage Zimbabwe now, given what is going on in South Africa over the same land issue. And therefore, what one would have expected is at least the West would give a leeway in terms of relieving the sanctions, lifting some of the sanctions, on Zimbabwe, so that Zimbabwe can stand a good chance, to grow. But in terms of democracy, that is a major tall order, because now that the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change,
right,
is in power, they're busy still, complaining about the result of the...
is in power, you mean? The
MDC is still busy complaining about the political party in power, the ZANU-PF, over the last election, because they did challenge it. So there's still a sense of feelings of insecurity, uncertainty, and that is also affecting private foreign direct investment, coming into Zimbabwe. So it's a very difficult situation. What needs to be done is, Zimbabwe needs all the help from other African countries, to overcome this very difficult challenge. Because the West will not lift the sanctions, not only because of Zimbabwe's failure to embrace the reforms, being propagated by the West, but is also because of the development in South Africa over land redistribution issue. So therefore, they are unlikely going to want to relieve the sanctions on Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe cannot be left alone like that. Otherwise, there will be social implosion, and it would affect many of the countries in Southern Africa.
Now, point taken now in all of your analysis, but Biodun, if you are to look at this from your own point of view, we are Africans, and we are definitely wanting something good for ourselves as a people. Now, when the Zimbabweans went into this election in July, they were hoping for the best. But now things are turning a little bit, awry. It's not what they really, expected in the aftermath. But would you say perhaps we brought this on ourselves as a people, because we chose leaders to direct us, but at the end of the day, the leaders end up suppressing or oppressing the people in general?
Yeah, it's quite unfortunate. The people they were right to have huge expectations from the transition of power at that point in time. The fact that Mugabe wanted Grace, the wife, Grace, to continue in power, and they didn't want a continuation of Mugabe, so the people wanted a change. They have the change, but what they have is a change in leadership. They didn't really have a change, in the political system. So there isn't any change in the economic situation. So people were so hopeful to the extent that many people in Zimbabwe, if you talk to some people in Zimbabwe today, you realize that they were almost, giving up on Mnangagwa being able to change the situation. And to be honest, I cannot see much changing under Mnangagwa.
So what now is left for the average Zimbabwean?
Unfortunately, they have to wait for the next election and then try and vote ZANU-PF out. That is the rule of democracy. They would have to wait for the next election and then see whether they can rebuild their society, you know, under a different political party.
Right. Finally, before I let you go, Alfonce, your last take on this.
Just to add on to what my fellow panelists have said, look at it this way. The United States extended the sanctions just after the election results were announced, because they said Zimbabwe had no culture of democracy. You see, so what that means is that Zimbabwe needs to have a culture of democracy. It's among the key reforms the West is demanding to see. It's also noteworthy that none of the Western countries have ever endorsed this Mnangagwa victory. They were willing to give him a chance until the military went into the streets and shot people up for demonstrating. So you have this dichotomy. They want to help Zimbabwe, but at the same time, it means the current.
Very quickly, make up your points. We're about to wrap up the show.
Okay, sure. So it means Zimbabwe. It's difficult for Zimbabweans to expect democratic change through the ballot without help from the West.
All right, let's leave it at that for now. Thank you very much, Alfonce Mbiwzo, journalist based in Harare, Zimbabwe. We appreciate your analysis on the show, as well as my guests in the studio, Biodun, Sowunmi. Thank you very much for your time on Africa Today. Now, with the look of things in Zimbabwe, it's now a year since Robert Mugabe resigned, but Zimbabwe is still in the house that Bob built, and many believe the new president hasn't done more than but paper over the cracks. Emmerson Mnangagwa's main virtue remains the fact that he is not Robert Mugabe, and for most Zimbabwe who have known one man as president almost all their lives, being the crocodile is simply not just enough. And that is our package for tonight. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one again, I am Esther Mokwariola, and always remember, Africa can only get better.